Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. And today we're going to talk about a book that I think you will find moving and in places inspiring and in other places challenging and perhaps disturbing. The title of the book is Letters from a Distant Shore. The author joining us in studio, Marie Lawson Fiala. And the publisher is a press that I have never heard of. It is called Cavan Carey Press. And this book is part of Cavan Carey Press's Laurel Books Group. And Laurel Books Group, and this is the seventh title in that group, they are fine collections of poetry and prose that explore the many poignant issues associated with confronting serious physical and or psychological illness. And boy, your book really, fills that bill quite well. Can you tell us anything more about Cavan Carey, about which I never heard of before?
Yes, Jim, and thank you for having me. They're a small press located in New Jersey, and they publish mostly poetry. They're a literary press. They actually turn out physically very beautiful books, as you can see from what they've done with mine.
Yes, they have. Beautiful job.
It's lovely. They publish mostly poetry and nonfiction. They have special funding from the Arnold P. Gold Foundation for the advancement of humanism in medicine. And basically that funding supports their Laurel Books imprint. And the purpose is to address issues of illness, dying, and disability, and hopefully to encourage outreach by the writers to medical professionals, people who are involved in providing care, medical care of all different types.
Okay.
One of the requirements of the publishing contract is actually that the writers make connections at least once a year with a hospital, a support group, some other medical or patient care organization, and interact with them in some way, providing a reading, participating in a discussion group, or so on.
So the publishing of the book is not the end of the process, but a major part of it. And they're hoping that the process of sharing your life experience, if you will, goes on.
Yes, exactly. And the premise is that medical professionals who see the patient from one side will have greater insight into what patients and their families go through during a process of illness or dying by having contact with people who have experienced that and written about it.
Well, when your story starts, nobody's a patient. You've been married to your husband for some 15 years, lived in a wooded, hilly neighborhood in Berkeley, California. Oh, how idyllic. It's the first home you'd ever owned. And here's where things get interesting. You believe, it says here, I believe, that through vigilance and determination, we could build secure lives for our children, lives carefully composed of homemade organic baby food, sturdy car seats, untreated cotton clothing, lead-free painted toys, filtered water, sunscreen, Sesame Street, and small and caring independent schools, and so keep all dragons from our shores. That's where your mind was.
Yes, and it's actually a phenomenon that I see among many of my friends and younger parents as well. I'm a baby boomer, but we as parents especially strive so hard for perfection, and I think it provides an illusion of safety. We believe that by taking care of everything we can take care of, controlling all of the inputs that reach our children, we can ensure perfect lives for them.
Yeah,
and of
down
course,
to the smallest detail that you can possibly get to.
Yes, and people become obsessed with controlling all of the details, and I've seen parents become very upset at a child eating a non-organic dessert, for example, simply because they feel that if they so tightly control what the child is exposed to, that child will grow up to have hopefully the perfect life. And of course, that doesn't happen.
That doesn't happen. And your life blew apart, I think is a safe phrase to use, on a Labor Day.
Yes.
Your husband called to you from the kitchen and said, I think Jeremy is having a seizure.
Yes. At the time, we had 3 children, Jeremy, who was 13, our daughter Annalise was 11, and our younger son David was 8. We were at home on a Saturday afternoon, Labor Day weekend, getting ready to enjoy a beautiful holiday weekend. I was upstairs talking David through a shower, and my husband said, "I think Jeremy's having a seizure." And at first, I didn't understand what he was saying. I looked at him, and he repeated it in a very calm voice. And then it sank in, and as I describe in the book, I raced downstairs from the master bedroom and found Jeremy lying on the floor.
Letters from a Distant Shore gives us a very moving, detailed look at Jeremy's journey from that time forward. But, there's another journey going on here, and I want to look at that first, and we'll do it when we come back.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.
Marie Lawson Fiala. That's the author. The title of her book, Letters from a Distant Shore, published by Carey Press, which we now, thank you, know something about. There's a person who really liked your book a lot, Jacqueline Michard, who says, in a sea of mediocre memoirs, Lord knows we got those, Marie Lawson Fiala's magnificent, meticulous, and utterly moving chronicle of her son's combat with death shines like mother of pearl. Open your heart to this book. It's that rare thing, an almost perfect read. And one of the things that adds to that perfection, takes it down the trail to perfection, is the way you talk openly about what was going on between you and your husband as your son was fighting to stay alive, and you and he were helping him in that fight. You write, I had felt further apart from Chris each day since Jeremy's collapse. We had very little time together. One of us was always at the hospital, the other outside, and our conversations mostly focused on medical issues and logistics. And I read that and I thought, couldn't they find some time somewhere? What was it like?
Well, Jeremy was in a coma. He'd actually had a cerebral hemorrhage. And then once he awakened from the coma, completely disabled, Chris and I were at his bedside 24 hours a day, providing around-the-clock nursing care. It was like having a young infant, but much worse. We had brief periods when we overlapped in the hospital, what we called our shift change. And we would mostly talk about what the latest bad news was from the doctor, or what the medical plan was for that day, or what the next surgery was that Jeremy would have to have. It was literally a rolling catastrophe that went on for months.
On and on. You're right, I thought briefly, I should reach out to him, say something encouraging, but I couldn't even find comforting lies to tell myself anymore. And a part of me that had feelings about anything other than willing Jeremy should live was hiding in a closet in the back of my head somewhere. Making Chris feel better was just one more thing I was no longer able to do.
Yes. Yes, well, I guess the psychologist would call this compartmentalizing, when you are focusing so hard, especially when you're a person used to being able to control what happens, on what's happening with the medical situation, and you are focusing so hard on your son's day-to-day ups and downs and medical crises.
And your normal life was a life of compartmentalizing anyway, because you're a lawyer and you're a mother and you're raising children. So you have to be able to compartmentalize to stay halfway sane.
Yes.
In that kind of situation. So
exactly.
And that was your, quote, normal.
That was my normal. And as a lawyer, of course, you're used to being able to make things happen. And when you're in a medical situation, you're completely powerless.
That's right. I wanted someone to hold me, you write. Give me a moment of remembered grace. Say words to make me briefly forget what was real. I imagined that Chris wanted the same, but all we had was each other. Two people near to breaking apart with grief and worry, still trying to look steady on the outside. And boy, that's the big mission, isn't it? When you're in that kind of situation, you're supposed to look steady.
Yes.
At least on the outside.
Well, the doctors do not interact well with hysterical parents. And when you want the doctors...
They don't interact well all the time with non-hysterical
Yes.
parents, as you found out.
And when you're desperate for information and you want the doctors to include you in what the news really is, you have to assure them that you're able to take it. And that means putting on a mask, acting the part of the steady, reliable parent who can take even the worst news and isn't going to fall apart.
Yeah, sock it to me, doctor.
And that takes a huge amount of energy.
Yeah.
We really had nothing left over for one another, not during those months that we were at the hospital.
There's a moment that you write about in this section of the book where Jeremy's coming out of some kind of surgical procedure, the very last paragraph. Chris and I rose from our seats, swooped down on the gurney quickly from either side. In unison, we stepped close. Each laid a hand on Jeremy's form, bent down toward him, gently folded toward him, closed over him on either side like wings.
And that, to me, is a metaphor for marriage and for our marriage. That's what held us together. That's what allowed us to get through this and brought us back together after the crisis was over. You are two wings connected, two parts of an arch connected in the middle, and you come together over your children to cover them, keep them safe, nurture them, and raise them. And we believed with every cell of our bodies in those marriage vows.
Well, you know who has wings? Angels.
Yes, indeed.
And you weren't quite angels, but I think you were reaching. Letters from a Distant Shore is, in many ways, a fearless book, willingly, for example, taking on the role of God, the value of prayer in this kind of situation, and a lot of other stuff. Just stay tuned.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at Jim Foster COC and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
This is Conversations on the Coast. Title of today's book, Letters from a Distant Shore. The author, Marie Lawson Fiala, is with us, and a new-to-us publisher, Cav and Carey Press, bring us this wonderful book. And a woman by the name of Gretchen Rubin says in part, Marie Lawson Fiala's account is lyrical and moving and utterly absorbing. In the tradition of Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking or Martha's Beck Expecting Adam, she details how ordinary existence can change in an instant. The reader learns how a family's terrible challenge can bring great wisdom, renewed spiritual strength, and even moments of joy and beauty. It's that spiritual thing that I want to focus on in this segment. You started writing or emailing to a whole bunch of people you called what?
Jeremy's Network, the
Right.
Jeremy Network.
At a certain point, was it your father-in-law?
Yes, my husband's father, who is an Episcopal priest, organized a prayer vigil on a Sunday evening using the internet to reach people. The network grew and grew because people added their own correspondence to it. It was probably hundreds of people. I never knew how large.
The other thing that I must say is that while this is going on, the prayer group kind of being developed, sub rosa perhaps, everything that could possibly be done from a medical standpoint is being done or is about to be done. No attempt was not taken that seemed that it might be helpful. So it's not like you guys sat back and said, take over, you higher power. It wasn't that at all.
We used every medical resource we could. After Jeremy came out of his coma, he was fully paralyzed on the right half of his body. He could not speak at all, and he was nearly blind. And at that point, the doctors had really exhausted every medical protocol that was available. They had contained the hemorrhage in his brain, but there was really nothing more medically that could be done to cure him. that was going to depend on his body, and we believed on God, which is why we asked our friends and our network to pray for him.
You had this candlelight prayer vigil.
Yes.
And could you ever really measure how many people took part in it? I mean, the answers you got afterwards, I mean, you could say all over the world people took part. But do you have any sense of how many?
I think there certainly must have been hundreds, many hundreds. We got answers from Finland, from South Africa, from Italy, from Australia, from all over the United States. People emailed back to say, we're praying for you, we're here, to share their personal stories with us.
To put it coldly, did all this have any efficacy?
Well, as I say in the book, I don't know. 24 hours after this prayer vigil, when the doctors had given us no hope that Jeremy would ever regain his speech, he suddenly started talking in complete sentences with a nearly perfect voice. The doctors told us they had never seen anything like this before.
And a bunch of them came down.
It was like a carnival in his room.
Talk,
the
kid,
whole,
talk.
Every doctor he had seen, the rehab specialists, the nurses all trooped through his room. They were just amazed at what they were witnessing. But, of course, they didn't, being rational people, want to attribute it to anything other than coincidence.
Correct.
And I would never presume to tell anyone that this was a miracle. I have my belief about that, but I think it's a decision people have to make for themselves.
And, I think that's probably the way it should be.
Mm-hmm.
That, people will believe different things, and they're not right or wrong, bad or good. Because of those beliefs, we should just, quietly accept them.
Mm-hmm.
The writing in this book is beautiful, sometimes poetic. And there's one part I'd really like you to read.
This is from one of the emails, part of it. The strongest, clearest knowledge of all that this year has brought is the hardest to articulate. From the earliest days in the hospital, I was in the presence of something much greater than ourselves. God did not leave us comfortless. God's love was as real as the doctors and nurses and machines that sustained Jeremy's life. I will never be able to thank you, our families and friends who cared for our home, and Annalise and David, who supplied us with nourishment and shelter, who helped us in ways too numerous to count, who gave us gifts of stories and poems and other instruments of healing. I will never be able to thank you and the many other unknown people who were moved to pray on Jeremy's behalf. You have been tightly woven into the tapestry of our lives. You will be with us forever. If I can offer one small gift in return, I share with you the discovery that the universe is a place of great glory and mystery, as well as great danger, that the light is stronger than the darkness, and that love really does conquer all in its own fashion in the end. I wish you God's peace always.
That's great. That's beautiful.
Thank you.
And the other thing that we need to touch on is that it's not over for the family and you after the the last procedure.
Yes, it's not over.
He comes home.
It's not over to this day. Jeremy is disabled, although he has made remarkable progress. But it has been a new life, as I say in the writing, a life different than the one we expected from ourselves, but a life that has had a lot of joy and a lot of reward in it. He is a wonderful young man, and he lives with his disabilities just beautifully.
One of the great things about your family, I think, is that your family keeps pushing on, or in a sense pushing back. The very last part of the book, I think, talks about the family's return to Maui.
Yes.
Where you had vacationed several times before, a place that Jeremy always loved, and how it took about 4 days for him to be willing to go into the water.
Yes, because he didn't want, he wore various appliances on his legs. He didn't want to reveal his disability. He didn't want to take the clothes off. He sat in the shade and read a book. And then every day he peeled away another layer of fear and got his toes wet and went into the water up to his knees and ultimately went out snorkeling with us with my husband's help and my help. It was a very courageous process to watch, having watching him re-enter his old life, but with a new body, a different body.
And at a certain point, he practically knocks you unconscious by saying, "Hey, Mom, I want to go parasailing."
Yes. I couldn't believe he would want to do something that dangerous, seeming to me after what he had been through. But he did want to go and be pulled up to 800 feet in the air.
800?
800 feet in a parachute being pulled by a powerboat in the ocean below.
Oh. And it was successful. He had a lot of fun. You had a conniption fit. Jeremy had found his peace, I realized. He was ready to go forward to meet the rest of his life on his own, with all the gifts and takings away that defined him now, a beautiful, perfect whole. My task was to let him go, to hold him up into the sun for as long as I could, and then to release him gently into the wind, into the care of God and the universe. It was time to lay aside sadness. It was time to live. That's kind of how you end this book, this beautiful book, this moving book, an important one, Letters from a Distant Shore, by Marie Lawson Fiala. And this has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at Jim Foster COC and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.